NATO defense ministers have agreed that a new master's plan to defend against any potential Russian attack as Moscow ramps up its military arsenal. Well, it includes plans for simultaneous attacks in the ballistic and that's the Baltic and Black Sea regions that could include nuclear weapons, a hacking of computer networks and assaults from space. NATO chiefs stress that they don't believe any Russian attack is imminent and Moscow denies any aggressive intentions. The plans were agreed during a two-day summit in Brussels.
We still have avenues and channels for communications with Russia, but we regret the Russian decision to close the two NATO offices in Moscow and to also stop their activity at the NATO mission here at NATO. NATO's approach to Russia remains the same as before, meaning credible deterrence and defense combined with efforts to have a meaningful dialogue with Russia. But of course, this has just become more difficult because of the Russians' decision to close the NATO offices in Moscow. And I think we also have to understand that the relationship between NATO and Russia is now at a low point. It has not been more difficult since the end of the Cold War. But we strongly believe that when things are difficult, when we are faced with challenges in our relationship as we are now, it is even more important that we talk. So therefore, NATO will continue to strive for a constructive or a meaningful dialogue with Russia.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg there. And for more on the NATO summit, let's now cross live to London, where Arise Special Correspondent John Cookson actually joins us now to have this conversation. John, good to see you. And of course, a good place to start this conversation. What military issues is really NATO facing at the moment?
Hey, Maka, good to see you. Yes, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg there talking about recent disagreements between NATO and Russia, a spat over alleged spying by Russians on NATO, and that they've kicked their people out, and the Russians have shut down the NATO office in Moscow. I'm sure it's only a temporary arrangement, but relationship on the surface at least not good. And Stoltenberg saying that it's reached a new low point there, but hoping that things will improve. You know, when NATO was set up over 70 years ago now, it was to curb what was perceived then as Soviet aggression. And here we are 7 decades later with NATO playing catch up, in my view, in respect of what the Russians are able to do. I mean, they once upon a time, the Russian military was an absolute joke, thinking during the 80s and the 90s, apart from its nuclear arsenal. But now, since, during the Putin years, they've made vast strides and improved beyond anyone's expectations, their military capability. I was watching earlier some footage of robot soldiers that the Russians have now started creating for the battlefield, and robot tanks, which apparently seem to be unstoppable. And crucially also, Amaka, they developed cruise missiles which are able to evade radar detection but are still capable of carrying nuclear weapons. So Russia very, very much seen at the moment as a threat to NATO, and NATO seems on the surface to be wanting to catch up in a big way, and that's what this meeting, this two-day meeting, is all about. Amaka.
Right. And of course, John, they're also laying the foundation for the meeting coming up next year that is supposed to be held in Madrid. But, after that meeting, we did see Jens Stoltenberg there give a press statement. So what did we learn, really, from the NATO Secretary General?
Well, being a military man, Stoltenberg rarely gives much away, and we didn't hear a great deal in the press conference that ended in the last hour. In fact, he said that the NATO countries are to improve their capability in the air. That means bringing in new jet fighters and improving the readiness of NATO's nuclear deterrent. And these, as you hinted at there, are very much first steps to what we'll hear perhaps later next year, more specifics on what NATO has planned. But certainly Moscow will be watching very carefully as to how NATO countries increase their military capability to match the great strides that I spoke about by the Russian military. Amaka.
And of course, I would like to know, how do you think Russia will really react? John?
Well, I think President Putin will lean back in his chair in the Kremlin this evening and smile quietly to himself and see that, NATO is making all the right noises as far as getting a message across to its own nations. But Russia is in a very strong position militarily at the moment, and there are experts that will tell you, Amaka, that if it, for example, decided to invade Ukraine, what the reaction of the West would be, and the answer to that is probably beyond sanctions. Militarily, very little. NATO is not going to start the Third World War over Ukraine, for example. And also, Putin's very much aware that NATO has China on its mind as well, great military expansion in the Far East there. So I think he'll be, as I say, quietly smiling to himself and seeing that NATO is taking the steps that it thinks it ought to do. But in actual fact, the Russians have an upper hand militarily, it seems. And the other thing to point out here is that so many NATO nations in Europe depend on Russian gas, Amaka. Now, no one wants Putin to turn off the taps and put lights out across Europe. So NATO has to tread very carefully as to what it does and what it says vis-a-vis Russia at the moment.
Absolutely. Well, we'll wait and see how, what is being tagged as a master plan to deter growing Russia threat, how Russia really responds. In the meantime, aside from Russia, Afghanistan was on the agenda as well. John, what did NATO actually agree on the Afghan crisis? In about a minute, if you can, please.
Well, there was some discussion about that terrible withdrawal of US-led forces in the summertime and the deaths of thousands of Afghans and also hundreds of allied forces in that withdrawal. And there seems to be a little criticism amongst NATO members themselves about that. But what the NATO did say tonight was that it very much will hold the Taliban to account, and it's keeping a very close eye on how the Taliban treat human rights and the rights of women, for example. But, in reality, there's no NATO presence on the ground in Afghanistan at the moment. Well, certainly not overt presence, although there may be a secret presence. And there's very little that NATO can actually do to bring the Taliban to heel, because the Taliban are pretty autonomous at the moment. They do depend on aid, but that's not what NATO is all about. So NATO can put all these fine words about holding the Taliban to account, but how will they actually do that? I'm not quite sure, and I'm not sure that Stoltenberg even knows himself. He did also add, though, that Afghanistan would no longer be a haven for terrorist groups, and to that extent, NATO can act if it wishes. If it, for example, sees an Al-Qaeda group forming in Afghanistan somewhere up in the mountains, in the Tora Bora mountains, for example, then NATO can strike from the air with a drone strike.
All right, John. Of course, that's a good reassurance. I'm sure the Afghan people really appreciate that. John Cookson, I would have to say thank you so much for joining me tonight on the program. John Cookson there, our Special Correspondent in London.